Welcome everybody to this side event discussing the impact of the current aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine on indigenous peoples. My name is Oliver Lord. I will be moderating this side event. Just for background, I have been working with indigenous peoples of Russia since 2009 and with the Crimean Tatars, indigenous people of Ukraine, since 2014. I'm currently heading Uralic Center in Estonia. Can everybody hear me? All right, thank you. So first, I would like to contextualize this today's topic with the mandate of the Permanent Forum. So it is clear that Russia's aggression against Ukraine negatively, even existentially, affects indigenous peoples of Ukraine, but also of Russia, in all the forum's mandate areas: economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. Indeed, the impact of this war on indigenous peoples is total. Not a single area of life has been left untouched. Let's also recall that the UN Permanent Forum was established in order to, among else, promote respect for and full application of the provisions of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And of course, Article 30 of the declaration says that military activities shall not take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples unless justified by relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the indigenous peoples concerned. Obviously, there is no public interest for this war, not for Ukraine, not for Russia, not anybody, nor have any indigenous peoples requested this war. So who are the indigenous peoples whose lives have been disrupted, uprooted, and in many cases also terminated by this war? Of course, on the one hand, it is the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars, Karaites, Krimchaks. The war is clearly hurting both those who are living in their traditional homeland, the Crimean Peninsula, occupied by Russia, where all kinds of persecutions against indigenous activists have dramatically increased since the start of the war. Crimea is heavily militarized and is used as a launchpad for this unjust war. The war has also uprooted the lives of Ukraine's indigenous peoples who have been internally displaced to mainland Ukraine since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, many of whom, among them several speakers today, have had to leave now their homes yet again to elsewhere in Ukraine or abroad. And if we add this historical dimension here, that in 1944, genocide was committed by Stalinist Soviet Union against Crimean Tatars, then the extent of this collective suffering by Crimean Tatars due to Russia's actions becomes really quite impossible to imagine and explain. But also, we should add that indigenous peoples of Russia are also suffering from this war. Even though it is very clear which state is the aggressor, which state is the victim here, in the context of the Permanent Forum, it has to be said that indigenous peoples of Russia are also disproportionately suffering from the war. The number of deaths per capita among Russia's ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples seems to be much above their share of the population. Some of the peoples that this seems to affect is Buryats, Ossetians, Tuvans, indigenous peoples of Dagestan, and others. And I personally really don't think that this refers somehow their wish to kill Ukrainians. Rather, it is the sad, very marginalized socioeconomic position of these peoples, which forced these young men to join army as the last straw to save themselves from unemployment, substance abuse, crime, and such. And while Russia's actions against Ukraine have been declared a genocide by many institutions and also by the parliament of my country, Estonia, parallel to this, Putin's regime is also committing another a similar kind of crime against its own people and its own indigenous peoples in particular. And this is also something that deserves to be highlighted and discussed today. So the main goal of today's event is to hear firsthand from indigenous experts and human rights defenders from both Ukraine and Russia about the impact that this war is having on indigenous peoples on both sides. And so the way we will continue now is we'll first hear some formal greetings, and then we will have separate sections to discuss the issues by Ukraine's indigenous peoples, then by Russia's indigenous peoples, and then in the end we will give some opportunities for missions and indigenous experts from outside the region to also make their comments if they so wish. And we will aim to complete this event in 1 hour, but if it takes a bit longer, then I hope you understand. And if anybody needs to leave beforehand, that is okay as well. We are live streaming let's say the first section before the discussion on Facebook. We are recording this side event, and we do have translation between Ukrainian, Russian, and English, which you can find at the bottom menu of Zoom. So, without further ado, I would like to first give the floor to the first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Ms. Emin Jepar, who will greet us via video recording.
Dear participants, as a representative of the government of Ukraine and a Crimean Tatar, I would like to thank you all for your interest in the plight of indigenous peoples of my country. For 8 years, indigenous peoples of Ukraine suffered the occupation of the land Crimea. We have been forced to again fight for our survival as we did for centuries, suffering deportations, oppressions, and persecutions. Russia was and is behind all the sufferings of our people. The number of crimes it committed is outrageous. Today, it's the 70th day of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Representatives of indigenous people of Ukraine are fighting in the ranks of the Ukrainian army and territorial defense units against the world's most famous tyrant to defend the right of Ukraine to be independent, sovereign, and free. Russia attempted to justify the war against Ukraine by need to counteract Ukraine as a nasty state. But the truth is that it is the Russian armed forces that appropriated the traumas of the past and who are killing the civilians only because they are part of Ukrainian and not the Russian occupation. In my homeland, Crimea, Russian policy is aimed at subjugation and assimilation, where it failed total elimination of indigenous people. The country is being burned by Russian missiles. Women and children are raped and tortured by Russian soldiers. Representatives of indigenous people suffer persecution for Ukrainian stand. Ukraine is fighting today not only for its own future, but yours as well. It is our joint responsibility to stop Russian war against my country. Not that Russia steal Ukraine and erase indigenous people of Ukraine and their cultures from the history. Otherwise, racism will not stop and will spill over other nations and peoples.
Thank you to Ms. Jepar. And next, we have the honor to greet His Excellency Sergei Kislitsa, Ambassador of Ukraine to the United Nations. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Dear friends and dear participants, today is the 71st day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the Russian aggression against Ukraine started back in 2014 when the temporary occupation of Crimea began. As a result, the first who suffered and were forced to leave their homes were the indigenous peoples. Now they are under attack again and have to save their lives from Russian shelling, attacks, and reprisals in the territory under Russia's temporary control. During the last 2 months of the war, Russia occupied some territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, traditionally inhabited by Crimean Tatars on the mainland of Ukraine. Russian invaders in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions use actively the practice of extrajudicial executions, tortures, and enforced disappearances to intimidate the local civil population, including indigenous peoples. Russia tries to bring more and more of our people and cities to ashes. Such actions pose a high risk that many representatives of indigenous peoples will never return to their homeland. It is unbearable to see that in the 21st century, we are not only the witnesses, but also the victims of the extermination of ethnic groups. Ukraine is putting tremendous efforts to preserve the inheritance of our indigenous peoples, and will have to put even more effort after our victory. And to achieve this goal, the civilized world must stop Russia before its barbaric actions have ruined Ukraine and its indigenous peoples. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now we are starting the section when we will be hearing from representatives of Ukraine's indigenous peoples. And I've had the honor to introduce Mr. Refat Chibarov, who is chair of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, the representative body of Crimean Tatars. Please, Mr. Chibarov.
Уважаемые представители дипломатических
Dear
миссий,
representatives of diplomatic missions, dear ladies and gentlemen, since the topic of our side event is Russian military aggression against Ukraine impact on indigenous peoples, I would like to pay your attention to the fact that the military or armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine started in February 2014, when Russian troops invaded the Crimean Peninsula, and at gunpoint, Moscow imitated an action that the Kremlin has been still unsuccessfully trying to present as a referendum, where the population of Crimea allegedly exercised its right to self-determination by deciding to annex Crimea to Russia. Back then, in February and March of 2014, neither the UN nor other international organizations, including the OSCE, the Council of Europe, could take effective actions that would force the Russian Federation to abandon its criminal plans against Ukraine and, in general, against the global world. Of course, the international community, international organizations, including the UN, did not recognize the attempt of annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation and condemned the actions of the Russian Federation, but no effective actions were taken back then. Starting from February 24, 2022, the whole world has been every day watching the terrible consequences of the failure of the UN and its institutions to effectively protect global peace in accordance with the norms and principles of international law in the case when the aggressor is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as in the case of the Russian Federation. And today is the 71st day of these terrible consequences. As a result of the fierce and bloody battles caused by the full-scale Russia's invasion of the mainland of Ukraine, the killing of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, the destruction of thousands of cities and towns in the country, the attention of the international community to the human rights and rights of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, the Crimean Tatar, Karaite, and Krimchak, faded, so to say, into the background. Moreover, in the newly occupied territories of Ukraine, Kherson and part of the Zaporizhia regions, the special services of the Russian Federation launched a targeted persecution of civil society activists, including representatives of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine. At the same time, peninsula occupied by the Russian Federation in 2014, the cradle of all three indigenous peoples of Ukraine, the Crimean Tatar, Karaite, and Krimchak, was used by the occupying power as the main springboard from where armadas of Russian military equipment and tens of thousands of Russian soldiers invaded the mainland of Ukraine on the morning of February 24, 2022. Every day from the territory of the occupied Crimea, Russian troops conduct missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Military planes take off from Crimean airfields to bomb Ukrainian cities. Of course, all these facts will become the basis for bringing the Russian Federation to liability and punishment for such a clear and cynical violation of international instruments regarding the rights of indigenous peoples, in particular the use of their territories for military operations. I want to say that during 8 years, the Ukrainian political nation has crystallized, of which the indigenous peoples of Ukraine are also an integral part. Representatives of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, together with other citizens of Ukraine, defend the sovereignty of their state with weapons in their hands. And the heroic rebuff of the armed forces of Ukraine to the Russian invaders, the high moral and unity of the Ukrainian society, the unprecedented international consolidation and support of Ukraine strengthened the hopes of the residents of the temporarily occupied Crimea for the liberation of Crimea from Russian invaders. And we have no doubts that this will be the case. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chibarov, for this statement and also for your leadership of your people at this very critical time in history for Crimean Tatars. Next, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Iskender Bariev, who is head of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, and he's also bureau member of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. Please, Iskender.
Добрый день, уважаемые дамы и господа, братья и сестры.
I would like to welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I express my gratitude to the member countries that supported the resolution that suspended the membership of the Russian Federation in the UN Humanitarian Rights Council due to the rude and systematic violations of human rights by the Russian military during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia is trying to present the attempt to annex Crimea as the will of a certain Crimean people, which does not exist in nature. False propaganda is being carried out that no blood was shed during the occupation of Crimea by Russia. During the occupation of Crimea by Russia, officers of the armed forces of Ukraine were shot at point-blank range. Activists who demonstrated their civic position were kidnapped and brutally murdered. Russian impunity for criminal acts in Ukraine since 2014 has led to an even more brutal and bloody full-scale military invasion. The Russian army has already launched about 2,000 missiles on the territory of Ukraine, including cruise missiles and high explosive bombs, which are prohibited by the International UN Convention. As a result of rocket attacks, significant damage was caused to the monuments of the cultural heritage of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine and Mother Earth. Civilians of different ethnic groups and confessions were killed including representatives of indigenous people and children. I cannot but note the death of 17-year-old Emir Bilalov, a representative of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people, who died from a Russian missile that hit the house at 5 a.m. in the morning on the first day of the massive bombardment of the territory of Ukraine. The homeland of the indigenous peoples of Crimea and the waters of the Azov and Black Seas are used by Russia as a springboard for military equipment and pumping of Ukraine. Representatives of indigenous peoples from the occupied territories of Ukraine, as well as the Russian Federation, are drafted into the armed forces of the Russian Federation and sent to war against Ukraine. These actions violate Articles 29 and 30 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Systematic detentions, searches, and arrests are carried out in the occupied Crimea. They intimidate people. A similar practice is used in the newly occupied territories, but in even more brutal form. When armed people illegally break into houses, use physical force, take away money and valuables, gadgets, as well as cars, and people can be taken to places for interrogation and torture, which they formed on the basis of educational institutions. For example, in Genichis, on the basis of school number 17. The invaders have created a special list of activists who are directly related to the representative body of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people, the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. In such a way, the deputy chairman of the Kherson Regional Mejlis, Narsula Taliyev, was detained as in places of activity, as well as activists Arsen Ibrahimov, Rustem Gugurik, and Rustem Osmanov. 20 cases of detentions or forced abductions. The whereabouts of Mehmetshayev Artur and Rahimov Dilshad are unknown. There have been at least 18 break-ins into indigenous dwellings, even if they're absent. And we can't guarantee that we have the whole information because people are afraid to report these cases. Only in the first quarter of 2022, Russia conducted 20 military exercises on the territory of the peninsula, with the participation of more than 11,000 military personnel and more than 600 units of military and special equipment. And on February 24, it began the transfer of troops to the mainland of Ukraine and occupied new territories, that is, Kherson and Zaporizhia region. As a result of the policy of genocide, the Crimean Tatar people became a minority in their homeland. An active replacement of the population of Crimea is being carried out. Using repressions, the indigenous people are intimidated, which are purposefully squeezed out of the Crimea as a population disloyal to Russia. More than 600,000 Russians were brought from Russia to Crimea, and about 30,000 Crimean Tatars were forced to leave the peninsula. In Crimea, people are forced to obtain Russian passports, and those who refuse are deprived of their right to property or deported from Crimea. Due to the full-scale military aggression of Russia against Ukraine, about 7,000 representatives of indigenous peoples became IDPs or refugees from the newly occupied territories. At the same time, there are clear trends of continued persecution on religious, ethnic, and political grounds. Violations of the rights to freedom of speech, freedom of religion and conscience, and freedom of peaceful assembly continue. At the moment, in accordance with the classification of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, 249 political prisoners and prosecuted in criminal cases during the occupation of Crimea, including 173 representatives of the Crimean Tatar people. There are 97 representatives of the indigenous peoples are in place of captivity. Actions of the Russian Federation are criminal, politically motivated, and grossly violate international law. We are confident that only with active joint opposition to the gross violation of human rights in Crimea and to the criminal and the military crimes conducted by Russia, we will be able to protect not only the indigenous people of Crimea, but also Europe and the whole world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Iskander, for your statement and also for providing some analytical information about the impact the war is having on indigenous peoples of Ukraine. As has been already said, it is not only the Crimean Tatars who are indigenous people of Ukraine, it is also Krimchaks and Karaites. And now I will give the floor to the representative of Karaites, Ms. Olena Arabaji. She's head of the Karait National Cultural Center, Jamaat. Let me.
Спасибо,
Oh, yeah,
господин Оливер. Витаю.
Thank you, Mr. Ludem. I would like to welcome the distinguished participants of our meeting. And I would like, brothers and sisters, it is hard for me to have a speech, but I will speak on the behalf of Krimchaks and Karaites. And Karaites are small people, less than 2,000 people, but we have our history and our culture. We have our language and traditions we're trying to preserve. Last year, President Zelensky signed the order that recognized Krimchaks, Karaites, and Crimean Tatar people as the indigenous people of Ukraine. Now I'm representing the Karaites of Ukraine and the community of the Karaites community, which is now in occupied Melitopol. And I would like to say that the aggression and the occupation of Ukraine was a dramatic blow to our people, and 50% of Karaites were forced to leave our homeland. And I can speak about the example of my family, big family, that have been living in Melitopol for 200 years, and now they were forced to leave Ukraine. They are now in Greece, Germany, Croatia, and other countries. I'm thankful to these countries for them hosting our people, but we know that our cradle is Crimea and we want to come back there. I was personally for 2 months on the occupied territories, and today I see here my friend Laila Ibrahimova, who will have a speech, who will speak today as well. And I remember when we met during the last meeting to support our army in Melitopol, and I could have never imagined that we'll be scattered all over the world. Leila, I want to hug you, and I really hope that we will be able to come back to our city and that our peoples will be able to continue living in a free Ukraine. I believe that what's happening now with Karaites, Krimchaks, and the Crimean Tatars is the direct genocide and the killings of the indigenous people of Ukraine. And I would like to call the participants of today's meeting to support us in our struggle. Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Thank you very much for the given floor.
And indeed, I will now give the floor to Ms. Laila Ibrahimova, whom you referred to. We're very glad to see you here. Ms. Ibrahimova is the deputy of the Zaporizhia Regional Council, and also she is director of the Melitopol Folklore Museum. Laila, the floor is yours.
Добрий день, шановне товариство.
Good afternoon, dear participants. My name is Laila Ibrahimova, and I've been living in Melitopol for several years. I'm a Crimean Tatar, a representative of the Crimean Tatars, and I've been working in the Melitopol Museum. And in 2020, I was elected as deputy of the Zaporizhia Regional Complex and the administration, and I've never thought that I will see the fully fledged occupation. On the 21st of February, Melitopol was occupied. On the 10th of March, I was kidnapped from my house, and I was the first one to be detained in Melitopol. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Russian soldiers invaded my houses. There were a lot of them, and they had guns in their hands. There were 8 of us at that time, my husband and 7 women. We were all very scared. At first, I was very confused. But after recovering a little, I began to ask why they came. And I received the following answer: on the basis of martial law. The intrusion was illegal. They did not provide any documents. They immediately took away the phones and searched the house. After the search, they asked which of us was Laila Ibrahimov. They knew everything about me. I was put in a car, a black bag was put on my head, and I was taken very quickly in an unknown direction. I found myself in a cell where the interrogation began, which was conducted by FSB officers in balaclavas who were constantly changing each other. They were interested in information about my ties with the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people and about the museum. They asked what topics are covered in our museum, what are the sections. I told them, do you understand what a museum of local lore is? You have local lore museums in Russia. We have about everything, nature, history, famous people, and we also have paintings here. Then they asked about Islam, the history of why I went to pro-Ukrainian rallies. They emphasized the topic of these rallies. One of the occupiers tried to put pressure on me, saying that they were already people who handed them all over and told them everything they wanted to know. They threatened me. They warned that the authorities in the city from now on are them. I replied that I had no plans to cooperate with them. After 3 hours of interrogation, they put a black bag on me again, put me in a car, and drove me very fast so that I would not understand where they were taking me. I was very lucky to be released. In the evening the same day, employees called and said that the museum was searched. The occupiers smashed the locks. We went to the fund where Thyssen gold was stored. They stole equipment and documents that day. On March 11, we came to the museum. We were lucky that the military did not find a video recorder, so we copied the video and passed it on to the Department of Culture. The video shows them taking things out of the museum. The search lasted about 15 minutes, according to the video. The city already had a lot of military equipment and Russian soldiers. As the director of the museum, I understood that we had to hide the exhibits. We buried a collection of Thyssen gold and other valuables in the basement, which was not listed in the documents. I realized that there was a great danger for the team. We decided that we will come on short-term duty. On 26 March, when workers arrived at the museum, they were followed by Russian military and collaborators. They changed the locks and said that now it was their responsibility to come and that we should not come to the museum anymore. On 20th April, the occupiers appointed new director, collaborator Yevgen Gorlachov. After that, they started searching the houses of employees and they even abducted them. Gorlachov and the Russian military carefully searched the museum for a whole week, interrogated one by one our employees, but no one provided them with information. Eventually, they went to the basement and stole everything they found. I don't know the location of the collection at this time. I really hope that the cultural heritage of the people will return to Ukraine, namely to the liberated and my native Melitopol. Thank you for your attention and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Ms. Ibrahimova, for sharing your very personal story. And thank you for the courage that you have shown. This is very inspiring to people in Ukraine and worldwide. Next, I would like to give the floor to representative of the Krimchak indigenous people of Ukraine, Mr. Vyacheslav Lombroso, please.
Огромное спасибо. Пани Лейла.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ibrahimova, that what you told us is very touching, and I'm in pain learning what happened to you, and I would like to hug you, and I believe that everything will be fine with such people in Ukraine. Can I speak Russian or Ukrainian?
Ну, я так понимаю, что можно и по-русски. Уважаемые господа, дамы и господа,
I will continue Russian, speak Russian. I would like to thank all the participants of this meeting. And it is very important to get the information that we are getting here today. Krimchaks is the smallest indigenous people. There are 406 people living on the territory of Ukraine, and the majority of our people are on the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. Every day, every week, and every month, we try to find those who left the temporarily occupied territories to get together, to continue working together and creating some common values. And the war, the active phase of the war that started on the 24th of February, destroyed all our plans. Most people had to leave or to flee, and the Crimean Tatars and Karaites, and we have the same story. We had to flee twice. The first time in 2014, when Crimea was occupied by the Russian Federation, and the second time when part of territory of Ukraine was occupied and remaining part was still under shelling. And I believe that no woman or child should live under such conditions. That's why most of our people were forced to leave, some of them to Israel, others to the EU countries. Krimchaks are Jews, and there is a huge risk that if this phase of war will be too long, Krimchaks will stay in Israel, will be assimilated there. And that happened on the 24th of February and continue happening now. Is genocide. I can support those who say that this is genocide of the Crimean, of the indigenous people and other peoples living on the territory of Ukraine. It's just that for the indigenous peoples, it is even more dangerous. Because when we speak about Karaites and Krimchaks, we speak about the strict number, limited number of people remaining. And I'm very proud being part of the big political Ukrainian nation, which is unbreakable, which is ready to resist, and which is ready to do everything possible to remain. And I hope, really hope, that all of us will be able to come back to our homes, namely to Crimea, as the owners of, because this is our homeland. And I hope that we will be able to establish our order there, that we will be able to feel there as we're home, and that we can to create such conditions for ourselves where under which every representative of indigenous peoples on Ukrainian territory is a part of the huge society ready to build and to develop. And I would like to thank once more that I'm glad to see all of you now. And I would like to thank those who gave us an opportunity to meet today. And I would like to hug each and every of you for your proactive position. Thank you.
We will now look at the other side of the coin, so to say. As has been already mentioned, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is also hurting Russia's own indigenous peoples. So we will have a short section on that, and we will be hearing perspectives from representatives of different indigenous peoples of Russia. We will begin with Mr. Pablzulenziger, who is a board member of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, He has also been a member of the Permanent Forum in the past and represents the Udage people of Russia. Please, Mr. Zulenziger.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I would like to thank organizers for such important meeting. I will be brief for my friends and colleagues to be able to take floor. And I would like to say that we're now having the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And I believe that normal people, and including representatives of indigenous peoples of Russia, were shocked by the war started by Russia. And so we began to unite to help Ukraine and Ukrainian indigenous people to resist this aggression. We had several meetings involving representatives of indigenous peoples of both Russia and Ukraine. And we have now two statements which are very important, and I would like to read one of them now. This statement of indigenous peoples of Ukraine and Russia, but we hope that our statement will be joined by representatives of other indigenous peoples all over the world. So the text of the statement of indigenous peoples of Ukraine and Russia with regard to the full-scale military aggression of Russia against Ukraine. On 20th February 2014, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. As a result, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the cradle of the indigenous Crimean Tatar, Karaiid, and Krimchak peoples, were occupied, as well as certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. On the 24th February of 2022, the Russian Federation launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Missile attacks on Ukrainian localities killed thousands of civilians. Representatives of different ethnic groups and confessions, including hundreds of children. Representatives of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine are being killed by Russian bombs, missiles, and bullets. Representatives of the indigenous peoples of Russia and the occupied territories of Ukraine are dying in this war. They are forced to sign contracts with the armed forces of the Russian Federation as they were thrown into poverty by the Putin regime. We, representatives of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine and Russia, express support to the Ukrainian people and in the fight against Russian aggression. We condemn the unjust, barbaric, and unprovoked war unleashed by the Putin regime against the peoples of independent Ukraine. We condemned persecutions and repressions against indigenous peoples, both on the territory of Russia and on the territories of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. We condemned Russian indigenous organizations that have publicly supported Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and its indigenous peoples. We pay special attention to the violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in particular Article 30, which prohibits any military activity on the lands of indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent, including the conscription of the representatives of the indigenous peoples of Russia and Ukraine into the ranks of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. We call for the creation of an independent international commission to study and prepare a report on the impact of the armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine on the indigenous peoples of Russia and Ukraine. We recommend the Human Rights Council to establish the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of indigenous peoples in situations of interstate conflict. Include the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the list of standards of the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. We also recommend to develop a humanitarian response plan to protect the rights of indigenous peoples affected by Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. Signatures under the statement: Dorjo Dugarov, Buryat Democratic Movement, Intelmenko, International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, Beshkov, Information Portal Russia of Indigenous Peoples, Ernst and Dulan, Congress of the Oirit Kalmyk People, Eskandar Bariev, Crimean Tatar Resource Center, Ludmila Korotkih, Crimean Tatar Youth Center, Zarema Barieva, Committee for the Protection of the Rights of the Crimean Tatar People, Elena Rabadji, Head of the National Cultural Karate Society, Jamat, Danilov Andrei Fedorovich Sami, International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, Diana Tanagasheva Shorka, International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, Vladislav Tanagashev Shoritz, International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, and Irina Shafranik Selkov, International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pablzulenziger. And now I give the floor to Mr. Dmitry Beshkov, who represents the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia and also the Kamchadal indigenous people. Mr. Beshkov, the floor is yours.
From Kamchatka. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Я хотел бы сказать, уже сегодня говорилось о том, что коренные народы страдают.
Today it has already been mentioned that the indigenous peoples of Russia have been suffering from the war. Of course, it is disproportional to the sufferings of the indigenous peoples of Ukraine. We suffer this war as those involved in the military action. And of course, we're responsible for this. But the death of several representatives of indigenous peoples, taken in consideration the small part of this small number of the people there, is a huge disaster for us. There continued devastation of lands of the indigenous people and contamination of our territories. And as far as you know, that majority of minerals, gas, oil are mined on the territories of the indigenous peoples in Russia. And under this war and the ecological restrictions are lessened on the territory of Russia, the Chinese and Indian investors are coming to the Russian market, paying no attention and not observing the rights of the indigenous peoples of Russia. The persecution of the indigenous peoples for their position, namely for observing the human rights of indigenous people, are still persecuted. And certain representatives of the indigenous peoples had to flee Russia, including after the war started. And I would like to focus on the following. I do not want to enumerate all the aspects, but I would like to speak about the dramatic propaganda of the Russian Federation trying to involve representatives of indigenous people to demonstrate that the whole multinational population of Russia support this war. There are numerous videos, dances supporting Russia. All these issues are organized by the special propaganda such as Association of the Indigenous People, RAICON, and other organizations. They're trying to involve indigenous peoples in propaganda, and they are also working propaganda at the international level. We believe that the heads of the indigenous people of Ukraine, such as the Association of Oryx, Association, the Inter-Regional Public Organization, Association of Indigenous Minority, Soyuz, RAIPON, and other such organizations should not represent indigenous peoples at the international level. They should also have no representatives at different organizations as the UN Permanent Council. And for example, Alexei Tsikalev is the representative of Association of Finno-Ugric Peoples, Antonina Gorbunova, who is the member of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. She's also the representative of Association of Indigenous Minorities, Soyuz. And we would like now to address particularly the UN ECOSOC to deprive the organizations that supported Russia's aggression against Ukraine of their consultative status, and also prevent the appointment of representatives of these organizations to UN subsidiary bodies, such as the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the expert mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples. We have just had the dialogue on the chairmanship of Alexei Tsikal, who said that we were not prepared enough when naming his last name as the representative of organization that had supported Russia's aggression in Ukraine. But you can find this information on the website of the permanent forum, that this person was nominated by the Association of Finno-Ugric Peoples of the Russian Federation. We believe that these associations cannot represent indigenous peoples at the international level. We appeal to international community with a request to establish an independent commission to study and prepare a report on the impact of the armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine on the indigenous peoples of Russia and Ukraine. Thank you very much for this.
Indeed, independent UN experts should not represent organizations that have made explicitly and publicly pro-war statements. This is violating the UN Charter and all principles of the UN system. So, next, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Nikita Andrev, who represents the democratic movement of the people of Sakha. Mr. Andrev, the floor is yours. Wait a bit, let us unmute you. Please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nikita Andreev, and I'm representing here Sakha Democratic Movement. I'm from Republic of Sakha, which is located on the east-north part of Russia. First and foremost, Sakha Democratic Movement and most of Sakha people against the war in Ukraine. And we ask, we are begging Russian government to stop aggression. I think biggest problem is that our local government following Moscow decisions, and most of the time it's against of the people's choices, the native people choices and will. Also, I would like to tell about a few other problems that my people have. One of them is environmental. I think everybody knows that our land is very rich for mineral resources, gas, oil, gold, diamonds. But as of now, all of the money that from selling, it goes to Moscow. Even all of the taxes goes to federal budget. Local people gets polluted land, rivers, destroyed ecosystem, and very high level of cancer, even for younger population. We demanding to restore dual keys rule that we had back in 90s, when local government could decide about licensing, permitting, and taxation. So it was to Moscow and Yakutsk was having dual decisions. We are Sakha people considering ourselves as a part of Mother Nature, and it's our mission to protect our land. But right now there is forest harvesting started in Amga, which is middle, like heart of our republic, and most of the locals against of that because it will destroy permafrost that will dramatically change ecosystem. But again, local government don't want to listen to them. Also, I would love to mention about Alexander Gabyshev that you might know as a shaman. He's still captivated in psychiatric jail because of political beliefs, which is violation of basic human rights. Alexander have to be freed immediately. Okay, thanks for your attention. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Andreev, for your statement. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Dorjo Dugarov, who represents the Buryat National Movement. The floor is yours. Mr. Dorjo Dugarov? Okay, if we don't hear from Mr. Dugarov, then I would like to ask whether Yana Tanagasheva is ready to make a statement.
Здравствуйте, спасибо.
Would like to welcome everyone. Thank you for the given floor. I would like to say briefly that I support all the statements that were voiced today. And I would like to say that the Russian state in itself is racist. People who are not Russians, who are not Slavic, are the people of second rate in the Russian Federation. This is proved by myself, by my relatives, and by my children. And we should document Russia's racism against indigenous peoples living on the territory of Russia. And I would also like to draw your attention to the need of collecting the information of the aftermath of the war on children and women of the indigenous peoples of Russia and Ukraine.
And it seems that Mr. Dolzhadugarev is now ready to speak. Please. We do not hear you. No. Okay. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. With this, we're going to right now finish the section specifically devoted to Russia's indigenous peoples. And we're also going to stop the Facebook webcast.